Welcome to another episode of The Backstage Creative, the podcast that focuses on the people who work behind the scenes of theater. My name is Krista Copper. I am so glad that you're listening to this. It seems like every time I open my social media accounts, one of my friends is starting a podcast. So I am so grateful that you're taking the time to listen to The Backstage Creative. On this show, I interview people who put in so much passion and time and energy into creating live theatrical productions. Today is my conversation with Kyra Sims. Kyra does a lot of things in the theater scene, so we jump around a lot. I like to talk to people who have a lot of irons in the fire because then we can just hop around to different topics, and I think that's a fun pace to do interviews at. So yeah, here we go. Here's my conversation with Kyra Sims. First of all, I saw that I was looking through your website and I saw that how are you involved with the Welcome to Nightville podcast?
Yeah, it's an interesting story because I'm actually connected to them in two different ways. So I started off just as a fan of the podcast, just listening to it, and then after I saw one of the live shows, I actually just tweeted John Bernstein, who is the inspiration for the music for the podcast, and I said, "Hey, I love your work. If you ever need a French horn player, let me know." And he wanted one. So he was like, "Yeah, sure." So at first he had me play just like a house show in his apartment. It was really cool show, like kind of free improvisation stuff. And then maybe a couple weeks later, asked if I wanted to play on the next Welcome to Nightville live show. So that was super fun. I got to meet everyone involved, and I ended up doing two live shows with them. But then completely separately from that, I joined the New York Neo-Futurists, which is a theater company here in New York. And basically everyone involved with Welcome to Night Vale is a Neo-Futurist. So so I connected to them in two very different ways.
Yeah, that's so cool. That's the podcast I listen to on really long road trips.
Nice.
So I saw that on your website and I was like, no way.
Yeah, they're wonderful. I love the people and the podcast.
Oh, that's so fun. Great. Now that we got that out of the way, the most important question. So let's start with your background, where you're from, any school you went to, and how you got to New York City and doing what you're doing in the theater world.
Sure. So I grew up in Tennessee, in like the suburbs of Memphis, which was fine. I think anyone who grew up in the suburbs kind of know, like, especially like in the late 90s, early 2000s, they probably know how I grew up. So lots of like Target and Starbucks and Blockbuster Video in my adolescence. Lots of watching bad movies with my best friend and playing Spyro the Dragon kind of stuff. And it wasn't really a serious musician back then. I was doing both music and theater in high school, kind of wanting to pursue theater more professionally. But then I went through some like pretty bad bullying in my theater department. It was a very, very competitive theater department, and I couldn't deal with the the bullying. So I sort of left my junior year. I left the theater department, but I kept doing band because the band kids were always nice to me. And sort of, yeah, it was one of those things where like one thing kind of led to another, and I ended up going to school for music. So I got my bachelor's degree in French horn performance at the University of Kansas, which is in Lawrence, Kansas. It's a great little town. It's like the liberal oasis of Kansas, sort of like Austin, Texas. And then after that, I moved to New York to start my master's degree. I started my master's at Montclair State in New Jersey, but I was living in New York because I was also interning at Jazz at Lincoln Center. So I was doing both. And then after the first year at Montclair, I transferred to Manhattan School of Music and finished my master's degree there. And I've been in New York ever since, freelancing. And about a year after I finished my master's degree, I started to want to pursue my theater passion, I guess you could call it, again. So I started taking improv classes at the Upright Citizens Brigade, which no longer exists in New York as of this year. And through that, I started getting more sort of theater opportunities, sort of in the like just the low budget indie theater scene. Yeah, and then I got the opportunity to start working at the New York Neo-Futurists first as a sound designer for a show that they did in 2015 called The Human Symphony, which was really fun. I had never really done sound design before. It was a lot of learning on my feet. It was at the New Ohio, and I remember just going in and kind of crawling around the theater, figuring out like what a speak on cable was. But that went really well, and I got to know the Neo Futurists, and they invited me to audition. Like so, when you're a Neo Futurist, you're a writer and a director and a performer. And I had done a lot of performing, but I didn't really consider myself a writer then. But I had seen the show that they do. We do a show during the normal times, we do a show every weekend called The Infinite Wrench. Back then, it was called Too Much Light Makes the Baby Go Blind. It's a show that's completely written by the ensemble, and it changes every week. And it uses a lot of like randomization and like nonfiction theater. I had seen the show a few times at that point, and thought, okay, well, maybe I could do this. And so I tried it out. I went to a salon that they held, and then ended up auditioning, and they cast me. And now I've been with the company for a little over 5 years.
Nice. That's awesome that you went to KU. I live in Kansas City, so
Oh
I'm
my gosh!
yeah.
Oh, nice. Oh, I
Yeah,
love
Lawrence.
Kansas City.
Yeah, Lawrence is such a weird town. Like I don't so I'm from like Western Kansas. So whenever I go to Lawrence, I don't feel like I'm in Kansas anymore because it's just kind of this little, like you said, an oasis of liberalism. It it feels very different from the rest of the state. So
Yeah,
it's a fun place to go.
it was a great place to become an adult
Yeah.
because I'm from a conservative state, Tennessee, and I moved to a conservative state, Kansas. But then in Lawrence, I sort of was able to choose where what kind of path I wanted to take, sort of politically and just like I guess personal morals, because it was like you got everything.
Hmm.
Because even though it's a liberal town, like it's still a very conservative state.
Hmm.
So you get a little bit of everything. And I really, really loved kind of coming into my own there. And I still miss it. And I try to go back when I can to visit.
Yeah. So in your work with the Neo-Futurists, are you primarily playing or acting, or what is that? Like when you're performing, what are you primarily doing?
I'm primarily writing and performing. The French horn gets involved sometimes, like if I write something for, if someone else writes for me to play it. But I'm primarily like a theater performer when I work with them.
Hmm. Nice. When you're writing, where do your ideas come from?
So one great thing about the aesthetic of neo-futurism, it's experimental theater. It borrows a lot from surrealism and Dada and abstract theater art, but the overarching aesthetic is non-illusory. So that means we're never playing characters. We're always ourselves on stage. Everything we do on stage is real. So like if we're picking up something heavy, it's actually heavy. If we're drinking a beer, we're getting drunk. If we're bleeding, oh, that was an accident, ouch. So we draw from our real lives and the world around us. And we also like to say that we're a living newspaper because especially since our show is every week and it changes every week, we're always responding to the now, to, to like what's happened that week. Like, for example, like I was in the show the weekend after the 2016 election, and we were definitely like one of the first theater companies to like be able to respond to that. And like we sold out both nights that week because everyone knew we were going to be doing theater about it, and it was very much needed then and now. So yeah, so we draw from real life. I like to write things about things that happen to me, about current events. I like to play with the genre within it. There's this little series that another Near Futurist started called Avant-Garde Blank that I like to play in. So it'll be like an avant-garde version of something. So like I've done like avant-garde romance, which is just very odd kind of comedic scenes. Did one called Avant-Garde Roots, which was my take on the teleseries Roots, just an avant-garde version of it. I'm working on one right now that I hope will get in soon called Avant-Garde Animal Crossing. Because I'm doing a virtual run of the show with we have a sister company in Chicago, and they are actually the original Neo-Futurists. That company started in 1988. So they've been around for a very long time in Chicago. So I'm doing a guest run just from New York, and the way they're doing it is every Sunday they release a certain number of new videos that are plays that people can watch at like in the randomized playlist, and so that's been really fun to make videos with them.
Hmm. I get this question a lot as a musician, and sometimes I think, well, I just ask a different question, but I'm going to ask this question anyway. Do you get nervous either when you're subbing, when you're, playing for Lion King, or when you're going on stage to improvise or act? Do you get nervous, and how do you deal with those nerves if you do?
It's interesting. I almost never get nervous when I'm acting or like doing like theatery stuff on stage. For a long time, I had pretty bad stage fright with French horn stuff.
Hmm.
It's definitely gotten better. It's definitely gotten better as I've gotten older, and I like to tell people it's gotten even better as I've gone through the years of being a neo-futurist. Like because of like the nature of our show, I'll explain it a little bit more. For the Infinite Wrench, we try to perform 30 plays in 60 minutes, and the audience determines what order we perform the plays in. And so there's a lot of experimenting, and there's a lot of failure just built into the system. So I've gotten used to failing on stage. And when you fail on stage, you kind of realize that the audience is on your side. They really are. Like they want you to succeed. The same is true in music, and also like in both worlds. If you mess up, it's not open heart surgery. No one's gonna die. Especially like I'm not even like when you work in theater, like I'm sure the people who do the rigging and stuff like that. Yeah, if they mess up, someone might die. But an actor messing up is probably not going to kill anybody. And same goes for a musician. I feel like that's also made me a better French horn player because I am less afraid of cracking a note. I feel like I take more risks as
Hmm.
a musician, and I just try to go for it. Subbing for Lion King was an interesting start to my subbing career. I met one of the horn players for the show. This is a very common story too. This is not unusual. I met one of the horn players for the show on a gig. We hit it off. He was super nice, and he said, "Yeah, I'll try to get you on the list." And I thought, cool. Didn't really think about it much because that wasn't really something I was pursuing. But then 3 months later, I get a text message from him saying, "Hey, are you free to sub on the show on Friday?" And he texted me on a Wednesday night. Can you come watch the book tomorrow, Thursday, and sub Friday? And I said, sure. Can I have the music tonight? And they sent it to me, and I was up till like 4 a.m., just like cramming, cramming, cramming. And then I went, and yeah. So when you start to sub on a show, you go and you sit, usually near or next to the person you're going to be subbing for, and with a copy of the part, and you just you watch the show. One nice thing about the Lion King, the production here in New York, is the brass are in a separate room because the pit's not big enough for the whole orchestra. They're like in this nice like well lit room, and they get piped into the theater. And so for watching that show, like when they weren't playing, the guy I was going to sub for could like come over and like answer any questions I had like in the middle of the show, and like give me pointers of like stuff to watch out for. So really, like even though it was like a last minute thing, it was really such a great first show to sub on because I was able to get that extra help. And there's 3 horn parts, so there were like 2 other horn players in the room to like also tell me what to watch out for and stuff like that. And it was, yeah, it's a fun show to play for sure.
I love subbing because I think it's such a rush. um, a lot of times you don't get a rehearsal, or I've been called similar like last minute, like I need you tomorrow, and then you're sight reading during a performance. I think it's so terrifying, and it's just so fun.
Yeah, it's definitely a rush is a great way to do it because yeah, you just have to, yeah, you don't get a rehearsal, you just have to do it. And they don't really care if you like crack a note or something. It's more like they just want to know that the show, when to come in, when you don't step in any holes. I think that's what really, especially for the first show, what they're listening for is like, do you know how the show goes? And sometimes with sight reading that can be hard, but I think if you have good intuition of like being able to follow your fellow musicians and really have an eye for the conductor, if they really like, especially for a first show, if like just having an eye on the conductor, and if they're like asking for more or less from you, to really like see that and respond to it in real time.
Hmm. Yeah, I found, especially when you're subbing, it's easy to kind of get focused, just on your part and, just what you're doing. But I think especially when you're subbing, like having kind of like reaching out with, like you said, the intuition and kind of feeling your way through the show. I think, other musicians give you cues, like they'll lean forward when they're about to play or something, or, watching the conductor. So yeah, especially when you're subbing, I found it's so helpful to be like super aware of what's going on around you, because that can really help.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm. And you also sub for Anastasia, like pre-COVID stuff. Were you subbing pretty frequently between several different shows, or kind of what does that look like? Is that pretty steady work?
Um, Subbing, it's sort of a hard scene to get into. So, Lion King and Anastasia were my only two shows I was subbing for. I only got to sub at Anastasia, I think maybe 6 or 7 times, unfortunately, because then I got my own show off Broadway, and then both shows closed the same day.
Oh,
Yeah,
sad.
I know. It's a beautiful. I think Anastasia is my favorite shows to play. It's a beautiful horn book. It's just all of these like soaring solos, and you just fit in so well. Like it's just so well orchestrated. It's just like just beautiful quilt. The
Mm.
kind that like keeps you cool in the summer and warm in the winter. It's just comfortable. It's I will always. I really wish I gotten to play that show more. But yeah, so me, it's sort of a hard scene to get into because there are a lot of musicians that want to get into that. There's a lot of musicians that have just been there longer than you, that are more known in the scene, that get called before you, which is why a lot of people get into it for like these last minute calls, because you really only get those calls when no one else is available. It takes some time, which is I think is also part of why I wasn't actively trying before I got Lion King, because I was getting enough work between my freelancing, and I also for a long time had a day job in arts administration. So like between those two and my theater gigs, like it wasn't something I really needed, like to have a steady income. But I do know some horn players in the city that consider themselves to be professional subs, and would get called to sub on like maybe 4 or 5 shows in a week. So it just kind of depends on your path.
Hmm. You also mentioned off Broadway. So you originated a few books for off Broadway shows? Is that correct?
Yeah, I've done 3.
Okay. So I'm sure the process varies between, the show and who's directing and music directing and whatnot, but what does the process of originating a book look like?
Yeah, it's interesting. You sort of get your hand on the ball in a way where if something isn't working, you can talk to the orchestrator and kind of negotiate with them, because I think a good orchestrator kind of knows when a musician is saying this doesn't really work on the instrument, or when they're saying like I don't want to play this because it's hard. So it's sort of like a negotiation with the orchestrator. The first show I played it was actually a reduction of an original orchestration. So it was reduced from a full orchestra to 6 musicians. And for that one, I was the only brass, and so there was a lot of negotiating with balance and endurance.
Hmm.
So there were some times where even if I was playing softly, like my sound was too much for the balance, so I would ask the orchestrator if I could add a mute, just to sort of add, like, kind of quiet the timbre of the instrument, and that would help. And there were definitely some parts where I had to say, "Can I please put in 4 bars of rest?" And so we would negotiate like when that worked for what was happening in the music, because it was a very challenging book. Even with me getting those breaks put into the part, it was still very challenging. For the other two shows were original music, so the horn parts were less insane. But there were still some times of like just negotiating with the orchestrator, saying like, "Oh yeah, this works." Or and I'm also when you're originating a book, you want to keep in mind your subs and what they are going to have to do, depending on how much preparation they have. So like there was one show where they wanted to put in this high quiet solo at the end, and I'm like, mm, you know, like maybe I'll get used to it, but like that's going to be like a terrifying thing for myself.
Uh-huh.
So I was thankfully able to negotiate myself out of that, having to do that. So yeah, it's basically what it's like for at least in my experience.
So are you given like a French horn part that's already written out and you're just kind of tweaking it a little bit, or are you starting from scratch with the part?
It's like a written out part
Mhm.
that yeah we then tweak.
Mhm. What have you learned about good negotiating during those processes?
A lot of orchestrators are really like the ones that I've worked with are really, really like open minded and like open to feedback. And a lot of times they will come to us and say, "Oh, does that especially if we mess something up, they're like, "Oh, does that part work?" We'll either be like, "Yeah, I just messed up," or actually. So I mean, and then yeah, like and then occasionally, like maybe during the break, I'll take the part over to the orchestrator and say, hey, this bar could I try maybe this articulation instead, or could this be a half note? Like, yeah, there was like one part where it was a little kind of all over the horn, and we just kind of turned like some eighth notes into like a quarter, and that like it was like made such a world of difference. Like, yeah, it's just like little tweaks like that, but that still work for what the orchestrator wants to to do.
Mhm. I think that's such a cool thing to be able to say that you've done. Most of the time, like as a freelancer and performer, like you do a show and then it's done. But to have something that you like originated and can put your name on and say, I helped create this and it's going to go on and other people are going to play it. I think that seems like it's a neat project to work on.
Yeah, it's fun. I've really enjoyed it.
Hmm. So I was on your Facebook page and I saw that you were on the Spamalot national tour.
I was.
Ah, that's one of my favorite shows.
Oh, it's so much fun. Yeah, I was on the tour for about 2 or 3 months, and then actually left the tour to do one of the off-Broadway shows that I got called for. But yeah, I was on the road with them from like September, October through December.
What did you learn about self care when you're on the road for Spamalot?
I would say, staying hydrated. It's very important. I would say that's number one. To stay hydrated. And I'm definitely naturally an introvert, so I definitely would make sure I had time to myself at least every day or every other day, where I would, go on a walk or, just like take a nap with my headphones on in the room, just kind of maybe go somewhere and find a place to read. Or even like sometimes if like we were on the bus, like in between cities and we would stop for lunch, sometimes I would just like eat lunch by myself. It's just kind of knowing like your own sort of social bandwidth is important. I think when you're on the road, yeah, those are my main two lessons I think I learned on the road: stay hydrated and know your social bandwidth.
Hmm. Did you have a favorite city that you visited?
Columbus was really fun. They have a fantastic art museum. I got to see my first Kehinde Wiley painting there. Do you know him?
I don't. I'm gonna look him up.
He is the artist that did President Obama and Michelle Obama's portraits.
Oh, sure. Hmm.
Yeah, he's incredible. And they have a Kehinde Wiley at the Columbus Art Museum, and it was just breathtaking. It was so cool to get to see one in real life. Yeah, that was cool. Macon, Georgia was fun.
Mm.
The theater there was super haunted. That was awesome. Those are the two that stand out in my memory for sure.
Yeah. Do you have any stories about haunted theater?
Oh god, that theater has a wild story. Content warning, suicide. I can't remember the time period, like maybe 30s or 40s. The owner of the theater, I guess, was having money problems and decided to kill himself. And he went up to the Thunder Room of the theater. So the Thunder Room is where they used to do like all the thunder effects with like big sheets. So he went up there, and it was like summertime in Georgia, and I guess he was going to get really, really drunk and then shoot himself. But then he got so drunk that he passed out, and it was like a Georgia summer, no AC up there, and he ended up dying of heat exhaustion. And I guess his body just like cooked,
Oh.
and like because they didn't find him for a few days.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, and I guess it just like cooked and dissolved, and they had to get him out of there using like bags and shovels.
Oh.
Like this is the story they tell, and they took us up there, and they were saying like there's still part of the floorboards that doesn't collect dust as much as the rest because like his oil seeped into the wood, and then we were up there and like just with flashlights, like you could kind of like argue that you could kind of see that. I feel like every picture I took in that theater had like little like orbs of light in it. It's just, yeah, it's super hot.
I wonder what it's like working there like year round, you know?
I know. Well, I guess apparently like multiple staff members have stories of like seeing that guy. But who knows
Yeah.
what's real and what's not.
Yeah. That's funny. And I also saw you're a comedian.
Yeah, yeah.
I love all the stuff that you do. Talk about that. What does being a comedian look like?
Well, around the time I joined the Neos, I had started doing stand up, and it was really fun. I really like it, and I've thought about getting back into it. I stopped because I had done, let's see, I got to do a set at the Greenwich Village Comedy Club, and then I was able to use the tape I got from that to submit to a festival, and I got into a comedy festival in Chicago and performed there, and that went well. And then after that, starting to perform with the Neo-Futurists and still freelancing as a French horn player, and working my day job. And I kind of had to decide. I had to sort of make a decision because it was too many things. And I knew stand up comedy is a huge, 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 huge time commitment because you're always writing new jokes and you have to workshop them by going to open mics. Like I know some stand ups that, they'll do like 10 open mics in a week, and that's like not a very high number actually. So it's a huge time commitment. And I thought I didn't have that time, and I didn't want to be a mediocre comic. So I decided to just stop. Who knows now, right? Back at the beginning of the year, I was thinking about getting back into it because I stopped having a day job last summer. I was able to get enough income from freelancing and these off Broadway shows that I was getting. So I was thinking like, oh, maybe there's time now, but in this new world, what's gonna happen?
Yeah. Yeah, that's for sure. I admire people like comedians and like people who do improvised acting. I think that takes so much courage. Do you think of yourself as someone who is like naturally courageous? Does it take a lot for you to get up and kind of be vulnerable like that?
Oh, I have been just a big old ham my entire life. Even though I'm an introvert, I do like attention. I like occasionally, being goofy or weird or loud to entertain people. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think I get energy from that interaction with an audience. That's I think it's different from social energy.
Hmm.
Like I feel like I've never gotten tired from performing too much. Maybe physically, but like mentally or emotionally, like I feel like I can just always I can do another show. I got it. I can keep going. Yeah, it's not something that has ever really scared me. Like like French horn has. Because just being on your feet, you can always find a way to a laugh or to a poignant moment.
I feel the opposite. I feel like if I have my instrument in my hands, then I can kind of like muscle my way out of whatever hole I've dug myself. Like playing a bunch of notes or just like stopping.
You can, but I feel like it's different. I mean, depending on what you're playing, like, it's unless you're doing like jazz or like free improv, so much of what we do is like this strict box
Hmm.
of music that people know how it goes.
Hmm.
So like if you mess up, people know. Yeah, unless they don't know the music that you're playing. And so I think that's why I get more nervous because I just assume that everyone knows exactly how my part goes, even though that's most of the time is probably not true.
So, how do you decide? Because it seems like you're interested in a lot of different things. How do you decide what to pursue?
It's just kind of who calls me when, really. It's been surprisingly easy to balance music and theater. Like this week, I wrote 2 plays for the Chicago show. I've also been recording tracks for 3 different composers. And so it's just sort of balancing. Like I make myself a to-do list every day of like what needs to get done when. Yeah, it's really just like a making sure I have my schedule all set, and so I don't miss any deadlines or anything. Especially right now, it's really just kind of remembering deadlines. I don't really have to be anywhere. It's pretty during like the normal times. My schedule with the Neo-Futurists is pretty flexible. Like the way we set it up is like you have to be in the show for at least 3 weeks, but after that, it's malleable. Like if you're like schedule yourself for 5 weeks, but then you get a gig, you can maybe leave just after 3 weeks or 4 weeks to do the gig. Yeah, as long as the show isn't going to be messed up by you leaving early, which it usually isn't because of the nature of it always changing, then you can usually make that work. So I've been able to balance both pretty well.
Yeah, it seems like a nice setup. How do you have any like networking advice? You know, I saw that you've played with like Room Full of Teeth and Alarm Will Sound and a bunch of really cool contemporary groups. How do you build a network that allows you to have a like sustainable freelancing career?
The number one thing is to always come correct when you do get called for things. So, always, be on time, be prepared, play your instrument well, and be easy to work with. And then people will remember you. I would also say if you're new in the field, a lot of people approach it, in different ways. I think, when I first got to the city, my horn teacher was a freelancer in the city for a long time, and so he was able to toss me some smaller gigs when I first got here. And it's almost you kind of consider them almost like seeds, like the little like cheap like low paying or no pay gigs when you first are getting started, just to meet people and have them hear you and know that you're reliable and easy to work with. And from there, it's a very like word of mouth scene. Like if I can't do a gig that someone calls me for, I more often than not will recommend someone else for it. I get a lot of gigs just from like recommendations from other horn players that I've worked with who have heard me and know that I can play, and I do the same for them. Yeah, it's just a lot of building up your reputation, making sure people know that you can come correct. Treat everything like if it were your show. Like how would you want your musicians to behave?
Hmm.
You would want your musicians to be on time. You would want your musicians to know the music. You would want your musicians to not be assholes. I would say, if you were producing a concert, how would you want your musicians to behave?
Yeah, yeah, you'd want them to care about it as much as you do, for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, I really only have one final question. Is there anything else that you would like to talk about that we didn't get to?
No, you're very thorough. Uh, yeah. I mean, I guess I could talk about kind of the stuff I've been doing during quarantine.
Yeah, let's hear what you've been up to during quarantine.
I think starting in like April, I started getting called for a lot of just like home recording gigs. And that it was almost kind of like starting over in the scene where I was doing it for free at first, just because I had time. And then as people started to know that I had a home recording setup and that I was able to like put out multiple things consistently with other groups, that like I started getting called for paid stuff. And people who have called me have recommended me for other people. And so I've started to build up. Like it's still, still not making like my regular freelancing money, but I'm starting to have like more income than I did like when everything shut down
Mm-hmm.
in March and April. Yeah, kind of a similar building up of word of mouth freelancing, but now just from home.
Yeah, what equipment do you use for your home recording?
It's constantly evolving. I also just moved apartments, so I'm still adjusting to my new environment. I have a Zoom H4n recorder that I love. I've had it for years. I have, and I for a while was using that in the 4 channel mode where I use the microphones on the Zoom and also plug in a microphone in one of the other channels and mix them together. But for the last 2 recordings I've done, like this week, I just used the Zoom and it's basically the same. I don't know why I was doing all that extra work. I was trying to be fancy and I did not need to be. So, but yeah, I'm still figuring out this new space. It's like this little room off of my kitchen, and I'm trying to kind of turn into a studio. Okay, got some foam, some acoustic foam, and I'm trying to just like look professional. But I really don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
But it's been a journey,
Mm-hmm.
but it's fun.
Yeah, well, I admire French horn players a lot. When I was an undergrad, I went for music education, and so you have to learn all the instruments. And I'm a bass player, and the first instrument they had me learn was French horn,
Oh man.
which, as I found out, a year or two later, was the worst possible instrument to start on because French horn is so difficult.
It's like asking someone who can make like really good mac and cheese like do the most complicated souffle at like cordon bleu.
Yeah.
So it's like bass is dope. Like I love bass,
Uh-huh.
but I feel like it's just so different.
Yeah, and there's so much like tubing that you have to get the air through, and the mouthpiece is so small. I was like, oh, that was hard. That was such a hard semester trying to learn the French horn. I had no
Oh
idea
my
what I
god.
was doing.
I'm so sorry.
And I was like, why doesn't it sound like it does on Star Wars? Like, this doesn't sound like anything
Oh,
close.
it's nothing like Star Wars.
The
It's
tone,
like maybe the Christmas special.
yeah. Ay, ay, ay. So yeah, I admire people who put in the time to be good French horn players because that is not an easy instrument.
Yeah, it both gets easier and doesn't, if that makes sense.
Sure.
It's like it's always hard, but you just get a bigger toolbox to be able to. You get like a fancier screwdrivers.
Mm. Well, great. So, my final question that I like to ask everyone is advice to young people. So, what advice would you give to young musicians who want to build a performance career?
I would say have other interests too, because you never know where you're going to draw inspiration from. Like I know musicians who are birders, who are cyclists and are chefs. I think it's really important to have like a varied life because it's going to be a fuller, more satisfying life. I feel like the musicians I know that where their whole life is music. I feel like those people are the ones who are more likely to get bitter
Hmm.
from the scene because it's hard. It's a hard scene, and a lot of times stuff happens and it's not fair, or just kind of like the rest of life. And if that's like your whole world, then I think that's going to hit you harder than if you have other things that bring you joy. Find like a variety of things that bring you joy other than music, and you can bring those things into your music. I'd also say, yeah, just don't be an asshole. And I guess to be more specific about that, if you don't like something the conductor said, a nod and a smile will go a long way. a lot, a lot of times you can either maybe like talk to them about it more in depth at a break, or just this is not a fail safe. A lot of times, if you don't change anything, they won't notice. Just depending on what the situation is, you can just sort of nod and smile and just keep doing what you were doing. Yeah, be on time is just such an important thing because you want to respect your colleagues and their time. You don't want to like force conversation just to be networking, but if you are able to find things in common with your colleagues, or if they have family, you can ask them about their kids. A lot of times, when I'm subbing, like the other musicians will like be showing like photos of their children or talking about their latest hobby. And if you have common ground with that, I think those are great ends to like forming those relationships. But but people will also know if you're being fake about it. So just be yourself, and hopefully yourself is not an asshole.
The music for the Backstage Creative was improvised and performed by Ian Leroy, and the logo was designed by Zach Rimbold.